Andy, we did a Q&A recently, and the question there was, why do so many people doubt that there is a God?
That's a great question, Alan. And you only have to sort of open the newspaper, turn on the TV to see some sort of media show, trumping some new survey that's shown that belief in God is crashing across the West. I just the other week I was reading The Guardian, and that was reporting a study done by St Mary's University in London, looking at religious faith among 16 to 29-year-olds across the West, and showing that in many, many Western countries, faith in God is crashing. I was really struck by, they had the stat that here in the UK, 70% of young people aged 16 to 29 say they have no religion. Now, it's easy for those of us who believe in God to look at that and get shocked or worried or disturbed, but I always think it's interesting to ask the question by what's going on underneath that. And I'm reminded of the fact when I went to Canada back in 2010, and I was out there for 6 years, I went there being told this was one of the most secular Western countries, and it is. But I remember catching a small aeroplane flight from Vancouver to Vancouver Island. So this was one of the most secular provinces and was one of the most secular Western countries. And we were flying through the air, I opened up the in-flight magazine, 12 pages. 6 pages of that in-flight magazine were all about ghosts. How to know if your house has a ghost, how to get the ghost to do things for you, and all these other kind of things. And I remember reading this thinking, this isn't a secular country. This is just a deeply confused country. And I think that, yes, people may be turning away from organised religion, but spirituality is everywhere. In fact, the famous Christian writer G.K. Chesterton once remarked, he said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. They believe in horoscopes, they believe in crystals, they believe in ghosts, they believe in goodness knows what. And I think a lot of that's going on in our culture. And so for Christians watching this, the first thing I'd say is, we live in a sort of new pagan age rather than a secular age, but we know the gospel works in that culture because that was the first century culture in which Christianity began. But why, nevertheless, do many people say they don't believe in God? I think there are some features of countries like the UK and here in Europe that are just worth flagging up. We live in a culture which tells us through the education system, through our universities, through the media, that everything that exists is just atoms and particles and molecules. There is no spiritual realm, there is no supernatural. And I think when people grow up having that drummed into them, it's almost like their eyes are looking down. They never look up. They only see, what's in front of them. Secondly, I think we live in a very nihilistic age that tells us, look, there are no big questions. There are no answers to this stuff. The only thing you can do is kind of, live life, have the best fun you can, and then you're going to die anyway. So what difference does anything make? And again, that's had an impact on people. And then we live in this incredibly self-centered age that tells us, particularly with things like digital technology and social media, that it's all about me, it's all about me, it's all about me. And that causes us to turn inward, and we don't look outward. And not merely does that cut us off from God, it cuts us off from each other. But all of that said, that's a Western problem. If we were putting this on Twitter, we might hashtag it first world problems. Look around the wider world, and the church is growing tremendously. 150 million Christians now in China, the world's most populous Christian country. Everyone said with the communist crackdown in the last few decades, the church should be over. The opposite's true. There were 9 million Christians in Africa in 1900. There are 450 million today. It's going to be north of 600 million in another 20 years' time. The church is growing tremendously. And fun fact, the church in the world that's growing the fastest is in Iran, with Muslims coming to Christ in huge numbers. So we mustn't be deceived by when we just look in our immediate neighbourhood of thinking things are depressing. This is just a little blip in a much bigger story of human history. All of that said, there's a challenge here for the church to go and engage people, to listen to the questions they're asking, to tap into that spiritual hunger that pops up all over the place. So for skeptics watching this, I guess my challenge would be, have you actually looked outside the West? Don't be an imperialistic Westerner who thinks that what happens in the UK and is reported in The Guardian is all that matters. Have you looked at the bigger picture of belief around the world? Have you actually looked at the evidence for whether Christianity is true? Because of course things aren't true depending on how many people believe in them. For Christians, it's all about the claims that Jesus made. And then for Christians watching this, I think the challenge is when we hear these kind of stories, when we pick up on these kind of stats that are thrown around, it's easy to get depressed, to shut the doors of our churches, bolt the doors, circle the wagons, and not do anything. But when we get outside the four walls of the churches, when we take the gospel seriously, and we explain to people why we believe, when we explain to people why we believe who Jesus is, amazing things happen. I would encourage anyone watching this video, go to the SOLAS website, click through to our blog, and over the last few weeks we put up there the testimony of several atheists actually, who were exactly, this was their story. They had their heads down, they'd been told that there was nothing other than atoms and particles, but something persuaded them to raise their eyes up, to look to some of these bigger questions, and when they did, when they checked the gospel out, they came to the staggering conclusion that Christianity was true, and they put their trust in Christ. Even here in the secular UK, many, many people are following Jesus. If you are ready, tell others. If you're not watching this, why aren't you? Have you looked at the evidence and pursued it where it leads?